But first, here's Vivian Parry with another edition of Am I Normal?
Hyperactive, disrupting lessons. I just did it. I didn't realise I was actually doing it until I used to get told off on that.
Nathan Harris. This kind of impulsive behaviour, along with hyperactivity and poor concentration, are the hallmarks of ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, a mental health condition known best in children and often treated with drugs. Psychiatrist Professor Peter Hill is a leading authority on ADHD.
Children with ADHD are not happy bunnies. They don't enjoy life. They're not free spirits that we are sedating because society or doctors dictate. They're not happy people. They are actually distressed by having fewer friends, by living their lives to a soundtrack of verbal criticism. They don't feel they're winning.
You ask yourself a question like, am I going to do it? By the time you've answered that question, I've already done it. Then the answer comes afterwards. I'm thinking, well, I shouldn't have done that. I like to be energetic. I like to do things and have a laugh, and I just felt like I couldn't be myself.
What would you like to do with your life?
Don't know. I just want a job that I can get on with and concentrate on doing. Have a car, have a house, have a family.
It's what everybody wants. It's what a normal life.
Yeah, but it's a bit hard for me. So I always end up saying something or doing something stupid, so...
Saying something stupid may not sound like a typical symptom of a medical condition, but a diagnosis of ADHD is in fact entirely based on whether the behaviour of a child or adult is considered normal. So today on Am I Normal, we're going to explore normal behaviour. We'll find out why some children are diagnosed as having ADHD and others are not, and who draws the line between what's normal and what's not. Less than 15 years ago, ADHD didn't exist. Now some experts estimate that up to 5% of children have it. Can it really be that 1 in 20 children aren't normal? Professor Peter Hill.
We choose, as a society, it's a social judgment to say, look, these children are outside the normal range in terms of their activity levels or their concentration or their ability to restrain impulses. And it's a social choice. It's not specifically a medical one. The North American practice is, of course, to recognise a more frequent, a commoner pattern of inattentive restlessness, which they will argue applies to something like 4 to 5% or even more of the primary school population, whereas the practice in this country has been only to recognise that in severe form, so that it represents about 1% of primary school children.
Whilst it may be very difficult for society as a whole to decide what's not normal behaviour, it's usually blindingly obvious to hard-pressed parents that their child's behaviour goes way beyond the bounds of youthful exuberance or normal naughtiness. Carolyn Pegley.
In the end, I just wanted to know what was wrong with my son. I just, if you like, wanted a label put on him, although people don't like labels, but I wanted to know what was wrong with him. And because we weren't getting any help with anybody, and it seemed like a vicious circle, and maybe I should have had a bit more push, in the end, I sought the help of an independent educational psychologist, and that's when I got my diagnosis from her. And she was excellent. And I thought, well, at least now I know what is sort of wrong with him.
Nathan started having problems when he was about 5. I mean, previous to that, he was at nursery and he was just Nathan. He was just a boy.
Monica Harris, mother of Nathan, who you heard earlier.
My sister came over on holidays in '95 from America, and I was saying to her about the problems I've got with Nathan at school. And she said, have you heard of a condition called ADHD? And I said no. So she explained to me what some of the criteria were, and I thought that sounded just like Nathan. So when she left, I went to the library and we found a book. And I looked in that book, and I looked at the book, looked at Nathan's schoolwork and looked at Nathan's school reports, and it was like somebody had written about my son. And that's when I found out that I believed Nathan had ADHD. And I was like, what do I do now? And then, lo and behold, I think that November, Kilroy Silk had a programme about ADHD. And there was all these women, all these parents in the audience saying about their children. I was like, I'm not alone.
It's stories like this, where parents have decided their child has ADHD before they get professional help, that some people find alarming. There's a great deal of concern that we might all be getting carried away, labelling our children as having ADHD simply because we find them uncontrollable.
Myself, I'm not sure that there is one thing called ADHD. I think there are lots of children with lots of different difficulties, and we're clustering them together under this rather simple description.
Gwyneth Lloyd, Head of Educational Studies at Edinburgh University.
It's easy to spot a child who has difficulties with their behaviour or with their attention, but whether they have ADHD, I think, is a bit of a more difficult question. I think what we're doing is we're narrowing what we see as the range of kind of, if you like, normal behaviour. We're narrowing it increasingly, and what we're doing is we're medicalising the children at the edges.
Many in the UK are concerned that we're in danger of seeing every difficult child as having a disorder in need of medical treatment. All this is fuelled by aggressive drug marketing and tick-box symptom questionnaires on the internet. It's argued that this promotes overdiagnosis of ADHD, not just in children, but also in adults. Peter Hill disagrees.
Oh, I've no doubt that it's underdiagnosed in this country. I think there's pretty clear evidence of that. It's certainly underdiagnosed in adults. I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. We hardly recognise it in adults, yet all the science says that it continues to be a problem as children with ADHD mature into adulthood. But the real issue is what one does about it. And I think what people are concerned about is the unthinking use of medications such as those in current use for ADHD, which people worry may have long-term effects, though I don't think they need bother. Worry might have unwanted effects on the minds of their children in the here and now, and might have physical side effects or be prone to misuse. That's a perfectly reasonable consideration.
The drugs that are used to treat ADHD can be enormously helpful for children. But if there's concern about labelling our children as having ADHD, it says nothing to the furore in some quarters about the increasing use of psychiatric drugs, which are popularly dubbed chemical koshes. Psychiatrist Tamsin Ford.
Prescriptions for the types of drugs used in ADHD have gone up very sharply, to the extent that some people are worried that doctors are currently over-medicating, and certainly in the United States of America I think that might be a real concern in some areas. In Britain the evidence is the other way around. A large national survey of the whole of Britain, 8,000 children, of whom about 800 had a disorder, and a proportion of those children would have had ADHD. When we looked at stimulant medication, and stimulants are the drugs most often used for ADHD, across all 8,000 children, we found that only between a third and a half of the children with the diagnosis at that point in time were taking medication. It suggests that British psychiatrists and paediatricians are still under-medicating.
So why is there so much caution?
I think, and quite rightly, British psychiatrists and paediatricians are very concerned about starting a child on medication, but perhaps we're a bit overcautious. And I think there are people who feel that the whole label of ADHD is perhaps medicalising bad behaviour and are intrinsically opposed to medication, some of whom are within professions who work with children, so parents can find themselves pressured by professionals who are a bit anti-medication, and sometimes parents themselves have huge concerns about putting their child on a medication.
For some children, clearly the medication definitely works, but I don't think we should use something simply because it seems in the short term to work.
When you say that you're concerned about medication, are you concerned about it because by giving it some of the other things that are important to a child are ignored, or have you a problem with the medication in itself?
I have a problem with the medication in itself, although I do think that the first thing you said is important, because it's clear in this country that children are not getting what they call the multimodal range of interventions that are supposed to be associated with the medication. I think what we need to think about is the impact on children's, quite young children's, developing brains of very powerful drugs. I think in 25 years' time, or maybe in 15 years' time, we will look back and we will say the idea of giving amphetamines to 6-year-olds was just crazy.
Well, we've been giving amphetamines to 6-year-olds since the 1920s, And there haven't been very many long-term studies, but the ones there have suggest that the kids that do best, who have these problems, are the ones who had medication. So I actually wonder if in X years' time we'll look back and think, gosh, we did kids a big disservice by taking so long to get round to offering medication. I think we're often woefully slow at picking up these children still, and that families often really go through the mill. They shouldn't be coming into mental health services at the point of crisis. It should be picked up long before it gets to that point.
Slindon College in Sussex provides a specialist education for boys who have problems fitting into mainstream schools. Diana House, mother of Christopher.
It's been a fantastic experience coming here for him. He's found his freedom and he's so happy. Christopher was labelled at the age of 5 with dyslexia, and we've gone along thinking it's always been dyslexia. We had no idea there was any other problems. We'd sent him to a school that had a special dyslexic unit, and we thought we were doing the right thing by him, and it was the worst experience we've ever had.
What age was your son when he was finally diagnosed?
14.
That's really rather late, isn't it?
It is, and the consultant told us if they'd have diagnosed him at 7, he'd be reading and writing by now. But because he's been missed and he hasn't had the ability to concentrate on his schoolwork, he's still not reading and writing. But since the Ritalin, which is about 4 months ago, he's now started to write, and his reading is progressing slowly.
My name is Stella Burris, and I have a son called Harry, who's 15. We just didn't know what to do with this boy. The doctor told us that we were bad parents and we were sent to parenting classes. And in fact, Harry wasn't diagnosed until he was 14. So we've had a long time of wondering what we were doing wrong and what was going wrong in our lives. Things have got much better since we've had the diagnosis.
Did you find other parents sympathetic or judgmental?
Judgmental, definitely, yes.
And what about the siblings? What do they think?
Well, they don't like him very much, unfortunately. He's kind of ruined our growing up years because always Harry was the centre of attention. He was always being naughty and in trouble, and it took all our time up. And they kind of resent him, but they like him a bit better now. He's calmed down, but they still remember the early years when things were bad.
What do you think would happen to Harry had he not
He would
had
have ended
the
up in Borstal or in prison if we'd have carried on the way he was.
Why?
Because before his diagnosis, his self-esteem was so low, his temper tantrums were so bad, he was starting to break our house to pieces. He would run away, we didn't know where he was, he wouldn't come back, and we had to get the police involved. And I think if at that point we hadn't had the diagnosis, he would have ended up in prison.
I didn't take medication until I was 14, 15.
And how big a difference has it made to your life?
A big difference. I mean, before I started to take my medication, I got excluded from this school about 5 times, whereas at the beginning of this year when I started taking the medication, I haven't been told off once. I hadn't had a DT, anything like that.
Detention?
Yeah, that's the one.
How's it changed home life? Because I guess home life must have been pretty difficult.
Oh yeah, home life was awful before I started taking the drugs. Like, I don't know, I'd fall out with my parents once a week, like maybe even more, whereas now I wouldn't fall out with my parents like 3 times a year maybe, like, not even that sometimes. It's just like, sometimes I would forget to take my tablets in the morning, and you'd definitely see that I've forgotten to take my tablet or something, just with the way I act and the way I behave. I do prefer to take my tablet than not take it. I can see that it helps me, and it obviously helps my parents and teachers and school life as well. So I feel like my parents appreciate me a lot more now, behaving at school, getting on with the work, not disturbing classes and stuff.
I had to think about putting my son on medication, right, because again it was something new. I read the pros, I read the the againsts. But what I saw when my son was on medication, I knew I'd done the right thing. I mean, in fact, I received, the first week that he was put on medication, I received a phone call from the school. He was 12 years of age. The school rang me, I thought, oh no, what now? And I thought, obviously the medication isn't working, I don't know what else to do. She goes, can you come and get your son? I said, well, what's he done now? She goes, nothing. She goes, but we'd like to close the school up. She goes, we'd like to go home. Because he was on medication, his brain had slowed down enough to take in all the input of what they were teaching him. And he wouldn't leave the school. He wanted more work to do.
You could weep for Nathan, so desperate to be normal. In his case, the drugs made a huge difference, but do they always work as effectively? Tamsin Ford.
About 70% of kids will respond positively to the first drug you try. And it's almost like a sort of magical eureka moment, because it's not something you have to take for a while for it to work. So once you get the dose right, there is, I've had parents say, my goodness, I was able to drive with this child in a car seat without there being a row and the child being out of the car. The teachers will say, this child's actually sitting down and working. So, when it works really well and makes a huge impact. Of the 30% who don't respond to the first drug you try, another 10 to 20 will respond if you try a different drug. And then there are about 10% of kids who have very tricky problems, who probably need very specialised care, who it's harder to make a difference for. And, I would always encourage parents that, really just give it a go, because we will know very quickly whether it's going to work for your child or not.
We always said we would never ever put our son on medication, but I'm afraid we've had to do a huge U-turn on that one.
Medicating our children, although there's no doubt that it can be effective, sidesteps a bigger issue, that medical treatments are only part of the solution. And in general, it's far easier to pop a pill than to try to change society. Educationalist Gwyneth Lloyd.
Even if, as some people argue, even if ADHD can be found to be, for example, genetic in origin, and I think that may be the case for some children, though probably not for most. Even if it is, the evidence we have from research done by people like Baroness Susan Greenfield is that even when illnesses like Huntington's chorea, for example, are absolutely directly determined by a particular gene, the conditions in which people live and the environmental factors make a huge difference to when the condition happens and how seriously it happens. So I think we need to be thinking about the kind of lives our children are living and the environments they're living in, rather than thinking about medication as an easy solution.
So then the solutions are not medical, they're social.
I think the solutions, they're social, they're educational, they're environmental, yes. I don't mean to imply by that individual children don't need individual help. I think what they need is help for themselves and their families that's about helping them to learn how to behave more appropriately, and professionals taking the time to work with the children, the families and the teachers to do that.
I've never seen social approaches as competing with medical approaches. I think the two interweave. Sometimes one simply cannot teach a child with ADHD because they are too inattentive. But if that child has some medicine that makes them concentrate, then they can actually learn. Medicines do not produce normality. They alleviate the problem, but they don't make somebody completely normal or completely healthy, not in the ADHD world. So you always need special education, special parenting, special attention to a child's self-esteem to bring that young person up to a normal level of functioning. I think the two are inseparable.
People just didn't like him. They thought he was disruptive. He was labelled as a naughty boy. He found that very hard to deal with because he's actually a very sensitive, caring lad, and he had this label of being this disruptive, bad child.
Even before Christopher got a diagnosis, his mum knew that the school he was at wasn't right for him.
The teachers weren't very sympathetic with him at the school. They didn't know how to deal with him, and I don't think they had the specialist knowledge to deal with him.
Did you find that the teachers were judgmental?
At his past schools, yes, very.
About you and about him?
Yes, I think about both of us. I used to try and cover myself by saying, my daughter's here, she's obviously normal, I think, we've done our best. There's obviously a problem with Christopher, but they just didn't seem to understand his needs.
At my last school, they didn't understand my problem, so they just thought I was just a kid who just was naughty all the time. And it came to the point where they asked me to leave. They said it'd be better off if I went somewhere else. So I came here and I calm down more because it's not all, like, if you do this, you get told off. It's more relaxed, and I just feel a lot more happier here because it understands all your problems. Teachers don't worry about you as much. They just let you do stuff, as at my old school. Every little thing the teacher would tell you off for.
So a more understanding school environment can make a real difference to children with ADHD.
This is not a child who is a problem, this is a child with a problem, and that's where the label can actually be very helpful, particularly if you then back it up with ways of managing the behaviour, medication aside, that are perhaps more constructive than merely being very punitive, getting very angry, shouting, whatever.
It is often the case that parents blame schools for not being tight enough on discipline. It is often the case, in my experience, that schools blame parents for not being tight enough on discipline. This is not a disciplinary issue. This is a way of helping children who cannot allocate sufficient thinking effort, who cannot know best how to restrain themselves in class, manage to comport themselves and manage their ordinary lives. If parents and teachers could ever talk together in a non-competitive way, in the same way as they sometimes can about learning difficulties, and see this as a social learning difficulty, then I think we'd have got a lot further on.
It's certainly teachers faced with impossible behaviour who drive much of the diagnosis of ADHD in children. But what happens when these children leave school, or when they get involved with adult rather than child or adolescent psychiatric services? Nathan's problems certainly didn't change overnight on his 16th birthday, but his treatment did.
They took me off my medication.
And why did they do that?
Said I was getting too old.
But you felt that you still needed it?
Yeah.
And what happened when you were taken off the medication?
Started getting into trouble, started drinking, smoking weed, started getting a criminal record, drunken disorderly or a theft.
And then how did that all end up?
You go into jail for more serious things.
Like?
Robbery and ABH and arson. And
when you were in prison, was there any understanding about ADHD?
First time I went in, they turned around and said, I'm an adult and you don't get, because I was 18 at the time, and they said, you don't give medication to adults, it's only a kids thing.
And how did you feel about that?
I felt hurt because I felt like this could have been my chance to get it back again. Do you know what I mean? So I can try to get myself back together and that, but I never got given the chance.
And you moved around a bit in prison, didn't you?
Yeah.
And were any of the prisons more sympathetic about ADHD?
No. All the prisons turned around and said they weren't going to give me any medication. Every prison I went to, I asked for it. And none of them would give it to me.
And what were their reasons?
Because I was too old to have it and it's only a child thing. And people with ADHD grow out of it by the age of 16.
I mean, that broke my heart when he went to prison. I just couldn't believe it. I knocked on doors, I pleaded, I cried. Nobody would help. Because at the time they were saying, it's just a childhood problem, it's not an adult problem. But it was an adult problem.
It's a common misconception that children grow out of ADHD. Some do, but by no means all.
Well, I think that adult ADHD has to be recognised because what we've seen in recent years is what I would regard as a successful revolution in improving the lives of a number of children. And a proportion of those are not going to leave their problems behind as they cross the 18th birthday threshold. If you look at the lives of people who have an ADHD profile in adulthood, their lives are chaos very commonly and distressing. Their marriages deteriorate, their ability to stay out of the hands of the police is poor, it's low, they get into trouble. Rates of alcoholism are high, rates of cigarette consumption are high, their health is at risk, their emotional life is a mess, they're much more likely to get depression. It's a horrible thing to have.
Latest estimates suggest that up to 1 in 4 of the current prison population may have ADHD. And here's where we get into really deep waters. Unlike children, adults are presumed to be able to control their behaviour. So the suggestion that the root of their criminal behaviour is ADHD is seen by many as an excuse. Phil Anderton is an ex-policeman with a special interest in ADHD.
the classic question is it an excuse to let people off their criminal behaviour? Well, of course it's not. Criminal behaviour is criminal behaviour, but this is the reasoning behind some of the behaviour. When we know the reason why behaviour has occurred, we can actually start to treat it as opposed to blame people for it. So I would never want to see anybody let off their crime and their behaviour, because we all have to stand up for our responsibilities. But I believe the process of the criminal justice system is about rehabilitating offenders, and we can't do that if we don't understand what's causing them to commit the crime. I'd dearly like police officers to understand ADHD, because it is such a big problem in society. That's a large amount of people. And then I'd like to see the key components of the criminal justice system again start to recognise ADHD, understand what it can do, and understand what we've all got to do to actually give these young people a better and fairer chance of breaking out of the spiral of being in the criminal justice system. Once they're in it, they're in it. We've got to get them out of it. And I would suspect there's more people with ADHD in the criminal justice system than the mental health system, and that's wrong.
I think it's £37,000 for one prisoner for a year.
For a year.
Right, £37,000 for one prisoner for a year. That money could be put into services, whether psychiatric services, the National Health Services, to help people like my son.
Instead of just locking people up, they should find out the problem first and help with the problem to solve it.
You know, by locking them up, it's not help their problem, it's making it worse, because they then come out of prison however many years later with other added problems.
And a criminal record.
And then they find it hard to try and get work.
Then they give up, and the same thing goes again.
You know, it's like a vicious circle.
Having ADHD as an adult can so easily escalate into petty crime and even prison. For children, often it results in failure to learn and a miserable time at school. It is indeed a vicious circle, and the irony is that it's only by recognising that people have ADHD and that their behaviour isn't entirely normal that we give them the best chance of leading a normal life in the future. Up till now, the main focus has been on changing children and adults with ADHD so that they can lead more normal lives. But I can't help but wonder if those of us lucky enough to be deemed normal should be making an effort to change as well.
The number one and most important thing that we've got to do is to overcome the stigma and overcome the myths that it doesn't exist. The plea I would have to the general public is don't dismiss this, learn about it, because it's real.